Okay, so this is my final vote on the third debate and who I think won the overall argument. So after watching this debate, I'm going to have to say that I'm going to have to go with Avik Roy. I think that both speakers did a great job, but Roy, in this particular instance, really made a stronger overall case. I thought Professor Sage pointed out a lot of problems with the current healthcare system, but overall, I would say that Roy did a better job supporting his claims with evidence and responding to the other side's arguments. I'm going to explain my decision using a few concepts that we've kind of covered, just looking at the modules in class, starting with the Tolan model, the burden of the rejoinder, the fallacy of overgeneralization. I think the first concept is the Tolan model. A strong argument needs a clear claim, evidence to support it, and a warrant that explains why the evidence proves the claim. And I thought that this is one of the biggest differences in the debate between the two. Professor Sage argued that the United States healthcare system already relies heavily on government funding and compared to a giant he compared it to a giant money laundering operation. It was a good point. I remembered it, very key, but he used facts to show that a large amount of healthcare spending already comes from public money. I didn't think he fully explained why switching to a single payer system would solve the problems that he had mentioned. That's just my opinion. I thought it was kind of just spit the facts at you, and that was pretty much it. There was nothing to really go back to it. But Roy, on the other hand, he built a more complete argument. He used examples from various countries, Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, and explained how those systems provide universal coverage while still using private insurance. He also went on to explain how Switzerland gives larger subsides to lower income families and reduces those subsides as income goes up. And that connected his evidence back to his main claim, which made his argument stronger under the Tolan model. And then if you get into the burden of the rejoinder, this just means when your argument or when your opponent makes an important argument, you have to answer it instead of ignoring it. If I was to debate someone, I can't just not respond to what they had to say. This really goes back to Professor Sage and one of the strongest points that he made about COVID-19. He argued that the pandemic exposed major weaknesses in the healthcare system of our country. And instead of avoiding that point, Roy responded directly. He pointed out that countries with single-payer healthcare, like the UK and Italy, also struggled during the pandemic. But his point was that the pandemic outcomes depend more on just the type of healthcare system that country has. I thought that response did a great job answering Sage's argument instead of just letting it stand on its own and just that was that. The last concept I'd have to go with is overgeneralization, and this generally happens when someone makes a broad claim without looking at all the evidence clearly. So Professor Sage described Medicaid as a very successful program, but Roy argued that the reality is a little more complicated than that. He brought up examples from states like California and New York, where Medicaid pays doctors much less than private insurance does. And because of those lower payments, some doctors don't accept Medicaid patients, which can make it harder for people to actually go and get the care that they need. Roy used those examples to argue that simply having insurance doesn't always mean that people really have real access to health care. I thought that this was an effective response because it challenged the idea that Medicaid really does work equally among everyone everywhere. And because of that, overall, I think I would just have to say that both debaters did a really good job. They were both knowledgeable in the topics that or each of their respective topics. They presented their arguments well. Professor Sage did a great job explaining the problems with the current healthcare system. I thought Roy was stronger overall when it came to backing up his claims, really answering the challenges that were coming his way and connecting his evidence to his conclusions. And, due to that, I think Roy presented the argument in a more convincing fashion. And so I would have to go with him for my final vote on which side won.